This is Comic Shenanigans episode 1057, a conversation with Marcus McLaurin.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1057. It's a conversation with Marcus McLaurin. This was actually a really fun, exciting interview. As people who've listened to the show hopefully know by now, I'm a really big fan of talking to anyone from the 90s who worked at Marvel or DC. It seems to happen more often than I'm able to find the Marvel ones. So if you worked at Marvel during the 1990s, I definitely want to talk to you. So Marcus was the next person that I spoke to, and it's really interesting things that he did working at Marvel. He was originally an assistant editor. Worked on Epic Comics. He most famously, helped kind of put together Marvels. He edited I almost laugh when I see it mentioned on Wikipedia as the influential Marvel Comics series Marvels. It's more than just that. Like, that was a seismic shift, I think, for a lot of people and how they viewed things. I remember being just floored by it when I saw that for the first time. I remember seeing the covers for it probably first on like the Mile High Comics pages where they would advertise different comics that were currently for sale, etc. And I remember seeing cover images for Marvels and just being floored by it. And so I think it might have been not quite when it came out, but I remember seeing those original issues, it being such a big deal, seeing them at like one of my first comic conventions and trying to get them. And so, that is not just, influential. It's really important, and it's definitely really important to me as a reader. So, definitely enjoyed talking to him about that. He also wrote, the entire 20-issue run of, the Luke Cage series, Cage, which I remember seeing on cards. There was trading cards at the time, and I remember seeing the redesign of Cage from that book. It was years before I would actually get a chance to read it. That was the 1992 to 1993 series. He's written other things as well, but that was, in particular, he wrote the entire 20-issue run of that particular run on Luke Cage. So some really interesting stuff in this interview. So I'm hoping that you enjoy this interview. Upcoming episodes, we're going to be having a bunch of really fun interviews coming up. We have the new editor of Back Issue Magazine, Roger, is going to be coming on the show. I'm actually, as we speak, about to record that episode. I should actually also apologize. This episode, it's been, I think technically speaking, when you look at it, it'll look like it came out on Saturday, September the 7th. But in practice, I was a little late on this one, so it actually is being kind of put to bed on the 9th of September. This is not Marcus's fault. We recorded his stuff way back in August. But I just didn't have the chance to actually put this episode together, which I'm very regretful for. Although, friend of the show, AJ Reese, years ago told me that the only person who cares about the podcast schedule is me, and that's probably true. But I've been trying to keep episodes coming up as much as possible on Saturdays, or sometimes, very early Sundays, and then kind of backdate them to Saturdays. So anyways, we got some good stuff coming up. Some good interviews that I'm really excited about sharing, and so I can't wait till you are able to enjoy those episodes. Thanks for listening for this 3.5 minute rambling intro. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thank you so much for downloading and listening to this show and to this episode, and thank you so much. And here is the conversation with Marcus. Enjoy. Marcus, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So before we talk about your time working at Marvel, I want to kind of go beyond that in terms of going in the Wayback Machine. And when did comics first become part of your life, which eventually led you to Marvel?
Oh, I've loved comics since I was a kid. I went to art school having done comics, having drawn comics, and I met some really great people in my art school, like George Pratt and Kent Williams, who went on to do some different things in comics. And I really just wanted to work at Marvel. So as I was getting out of college, In college, I actually created a comic called Static Fish as a club, and we published once every semester. And by my understanding, it still exists at Pratt. So,
oh, really?
There's still a comic called Static Fish that's published by Pratt Institute students.
That's amazing. What a legacy.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I was pretty happy when I found out about it. And so then my last part of working at Pratt, a teacher, Amy Snyder, got me an internship at Marvel. And I was an intern for Mark Grunwald and Howard Mackey in the official history of the Marvel Universe office. So my first job as an intern was working on doing the research for images for that deluxe edition book. And that was a lot of fun. I met some friends, David Wall, who's still in comics, Mark Siri, who's moved into NBC, and lots of people that, it was a great time to be at Marvel. And from there, when my internship was up, I wanted to get a job there. So at that time, there was an editorial assistant position that opened up under Archie Goodwin. And so I was the editorial assistant under Archie, which was essentially the editorial secretary for Epic Comics. So I got to work for Epic with Dan Chichester and Margaret and especially Archie. So I really got to work with some of the best there. And then from there, once an assistant editor position came up, I actually applied for that and got to be the assistant editor to Carl Potts. And so that was my first official, working in editorial for Marvel. And I really liked that office. Carl taught me a whole heck of a lot about schedules and skills in drawing and giving feedback to artists and just doing quality work on a deadline. He was one of the big sticklers for getting his books out on time.
Kind of an amazing way to kind of enter into the, working at Marvel and having those three guys as kind of like the main guys you originally work with is really something, because those were, again, in terms of legacy and the forces that they really helped kind of usher in, like they were heavyweights, and you're learning from these guys.
Yeah, and it was great at the time. Mark Grunwald had a thing called assistant editor school, which he realized that people who were assistant editors, their goal was to be editors. And so a lot of people who were editors at that time had worked in comics forever. So the assistant editors who were coming up, he wanted to really train them in how to tell stories well, how to help writers tell stories well, and how to help artists tell stories well. And we had a lot of retreats where we had a lot of fun, and, worked on learning the craft of comics, which Mark Grunwald was the expert at. And so that was really fun. I remember that time at Marvel was really great, especially being an assistant editor, because you have all of the fun with none of the pressure. The pressure's on the editor. And we did things like, we had a paintball team, that we would go off and do things in paintball, and we would go and go to the, at the time we were at 387 Park Avenue South, in Manhattan, and there were, floors that were being worked on, being developed for people to move into. And so they were gutting them and then repositioning them. While they were gutting them, we would sneak up there, in the stairway and then use a floor to play paintball. So we'd be running through an urban building and just shooting each other with paintballs. It was really fun.
That's great. Now, when you're interning under Mark, not just working with Mark Grunwald, but again, a hugely important legacy that he brought in was the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. So you get to work on one of the iterations of that. And as you said, you're looking through images, etc. What was the vibe in the office at that time working on a project like that? Obviously, it wasn't the initial official handbook. So this was kind of the second version of the deluxe, right? So what was the vibe working on the deluxe and?
Well, actually, no, it was working on the regular book.
Was the regular book? Okay.
Yeah, it was just essentially the deluxe was just a repackaging of it. And at the time that I came in, it was a lot about. The thing I remember the most was working near the end and on the Book of the Dead, the book of, characters had died. And it was really fun working on that. I remember working a lot with Mark, who was an expert on content. Peter Sanderson, who was, the historian of Marvel Comics. Mm-hmm. And Elliot. Gosh, I'm really bad at last names.
That's okay.
Elliot Brown. And he was a person who would do all the technical drawings and a lot of photography for the book. So I got to work with a lot of those people and really just dig into the meat of Marvel Comics and the history books I had never read, and got to go down to the archives and unfold the proofs that they had there of the original black and white drawings, the ink drawings that they used to make the colored drawings. And just doing the research, because it was up to us as the interns. They would say we need some information on this character, and so we would go and find an image that was a typical image, like from that was drawn years ago of that mm-hmm. character, using their powers or their death scene or something like that.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and Howard and Mark were a great team. Howard then left, and Greg Wright became his assistant. And that office in particular was really fun because at the time all the offices were laid out around the bullpen. The bullpen was a central area that they had that the artists work on. The artists would do, pasting up word balloons or art corrections or doing coloring sometimes. And we would. All the offices around the outside had glass as their fronts, and so each office you could see each office, and you could see into each office. And Mark took advantage of that by taking that office, that fishbowl office, building a platform at the back onto which he put his desk and his assistant's desk. So when you walk in, you'd basically be looking up at them, and the space in front of those desks he would fill with make-readies, like the comics, the comic samples that we would get from the press to just say, this is what it looks like and it's coming out. And just wadding them up and making a huge wall that when you looked through the fishbowl, at the door, all you saw was a huge wall of wadded up comics that they would often dive off of their desks into, like as a pile of leaves.
So I'm curious about working in this kind of environment. You have someone like Mark who, everyone says, was kind of the heart and soul of the company. It was definitely a lot of fun to be around. And then you're also working under, Jim Shooter at the time was the editor-in-chief. What was the vibe like with, because obviously that's two very different styles kind of going up against one another. What was your feeling working in an office where you had such polar opposites?
I was there right, my internship was during the period where Jim Shooter was out at Marvel. So I didn't really get to experience a lot of it. I just got to experience, the sort of the relief and the joy afterwards. Gotcha. People were really happy that he was gone. I literally had no experiences with him. So I only knew him through other people's stories of him.
Gotcha. So working under Tom DeFalco then would have been, I as you said, everyone seemed happy at the outset because Shooter was gone. So now it's a very different kind of feel moving forward.
Yes, and it was a great place. There was a lot of camaraderie. People, it was just a group of friends who loved making comics, who loved the characters and acted, as we were told in assistant editor school, which is no longer true, as the people who protect the characters. Like, you stop someone from saying, oh yeah, you know what, Spider-Man has a short stint where he's a pedophile or things that you just don't do with the characters that people love to do, that seem like DC loved to do with their characters. Taking beloved characters like Green Lantern and saying, oh yeah, you know what, he's actually evil, and which is sort of a betrayal of people who loved that character. Mm-hmm. So we would you could beat the character up, but you got them out in the end. You didn't leave them beat up. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And
now, I'm curious, as you progress through editorial, and we'll get into a little bit more of them in a minute, I'm curious what lessons you took from people like Grunwald, like Archie, who have such an impact on Marvel and, the kind of ethos that kind of permeated Marvel at that time. I'm curious what lessons you took from them as you progressed and became a full editor later on.
They were mainly, the best lesson I got from them was the idea that if an editor is really good, they do very little work. They hire the right writer, they hire the right artist, they put them together, get a good collaboration going, help spark new ideas in them, but then let them run with those ideas. And, that's the skill. And if you need to change something, I once heard Mark tell a story about Louise Simonson when she was an editor, and saying how she could make someone change elements of their story to what she suggested while making it entirely seem their idea to change. And that was always a goal, and this is just having real respect for the creative process and for people who wanted to do great things and then could have respect for an editor that similarly wanted them to have great things, so that you're working with the editor, not against them. You know that the editor is on your side and trying to craft best stories for the characters and for the readers, and not just trying to beat you into shape to do the stories that they wanted you to do.
When you're working with Carl, was there a time, like when you're looking around the office, was there ever, I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't sound negative, but was there ever another kind of group or family of titles that you would have loved to have been working on as an editor at that point? I mean, obviously you're working on a little bit more of the kind of grounded stuff. You're doing Moon Knight and Punisher, et cetera. Were there other books that you were like, oh man, I really wish I was on that character?
Well, I mean, the person at the time, Mark had all of the Avengers characters. So he had Avengers and the ancillary characters that also were in the Avengers, including Captain America. But he couldn't edit Captain America because he was writing Captain America. So that went to Ralph Macchio. And I think Ralph Macchio he had most of the books that I really liked at that time. So he had Captain America, he had Daredevil, and Daredevil was just the hottest thing at the time, because it went from Frank Miller's run to I can't remember who was writing.
Ann Nocenti? Yes,
Ann Nocenti, who made Typhoid Mary, and it was just, those stories were amazing. It's just like, that's an example of somebody who had the ability and the love of the character to do something amazing, and also was teamed up with John Romita Jr., who was, just brought all of her visions to life, and it was really cool to see all those characters. So, but those are the books that I would have loved to have worked on. But Ralph and I didn't get along the best.
What about you and Carl?
La Bamba. I do not know why. And I had at the time I had a faux hawk, where I had my hair cut short on the side and then longer in the middle, and he just incessantly made fun of me for that. So we didn't get along too great.
No, I guess not. Now, what was your working relationship with Carl like?
Carl was great. Carl taught me a lot. He had a lot of respect. Everybody had a lot of respect for him. He's very soft-spoken, but he was very emphatic in his desire for quality and his desire to, make sure that he was doing the best, that the people who were working on his stable of books were doing their best jobs. He wouldn't get in a lot of people's way. I know that, for example, when he got the Punisher, it started off with the Mike Zeck stuff, which happened before my time. But when it became its own comic, he was the one that hired Mike Baron to write it, and it was written in a very different style. Mike Baron was not crazy about the Marvel Universe, but he was really great at writing the gritty types of stories, having come off of Badger. That his issues of the Punisher were, and he, created characters like Microchip, he was like a sidekick, and just had unlimited creativity and a way of writing scripts that was both visual, like he would literally draw out each page, with the dialogue, and that became the script that he would use, that the artists would get, and they would translate that into their own version of it, and then Mike would use a lot of his same dialogue. I mean, that was a unique way of working. That was not particularly the Marvel style, and that was kind of unusual and really interesting. I found it. And it was, the Punisher was a loved character, and I think those books just kept going up in quality and style.
It was an interesting run too, just in terms of some of the artists you guys were having come on to the book. I mean, you have a young Will Spataccio, you have, I think Eric Larson did a couple issues, like very interesting talent that was kind of on the bubble, about to pop in a big way. And they kind of cycle through Punisher, and what Jim Lee did Punisher War Journal. Like, you had all these guys kind of coming through, kind of making a stop on the Punisher along the way.
Yeah, I mean, Carl had an eye for talent. He would go and develop talent, and I think he found Jim Lee. He found Will Spataccio. He found a lot of those people and helped them develop along the way. I believe he found them. I can't be positive, but I mean, I know that he nurtured a lot of them, and that they were friends, with each other out in California. And I remember one time Jim Lee came into the office as a young artist and was hanging out with Mike Mignola. And right after that, Jim Lee's stuff started looking a whole lot like Mike Mignola's stuff. And because Jim was just a sponge for talent. He would look at someone's style, figure out what he liked about it, and absorb that stuff into his work, which was really a unique talent.
Well, I guess I have to ask, seeing someone like that in their kind of nascent state and then seeing them evolve, how crazy was that for everyone in the office when he started to explode? But suddenly, it really turned that corner, and it becomes the kind of the Jim Lee everyone kind of remembers from X-Men #1 in that period. But obviously, there's a few years leading up to that where, as I said, he's working on Punisher, he's starting to cut his teeth on X-Men. So what is it like to kind of watch someone blow up in that way, which I don't think we've seen a lot of artists kind of blow up in that way in comics?
Yeah, it was very cool. I mean, I sort of got over my fanboy mentality. It's what we called them, because I had it a lot when I came into Marvel. And my favorite artist at the time, having read New Mutants, was Bill Sienkiewicz. Mm-hmm. And I still love his stuff to this day. But I was at a party at Kieran Dwyer's apartment. And Bill Sienkiewicz was there, and I was just like, hey, I just got to tell you, I really love your stuff. And he was, it's a social gathering. He was not expecting somebody to go all drooly, on him. So after that, I really realized it's everybody is a person. Everybody's, they have a talent. You can like their work, but, just get to know people as a person, and they will be a lot happier with you, Mm-hmm. It's there's a mentality that when you go and you meet someone whose work you really like, that you want to just sort of fawn over them, but it's just better to just say, hey, I really like your work, what do you like? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, no. But Bill Sienkiewicz is definitely my favorite artist at the time. I loved the stuff he was doing on New Mutants, and all of his, painted covers.
Of course. Now, in and around this time, I believe under Carl's purview as well, is a book that I always thought was an interesting, as you said, most titles seem to be naturally grouped together, and then there was kind of others that didn't feel as naturally grouped. So Alpha Flight is a book I guess you guys worked on as well, which feels like it was kind of left over from somewhere else, almost because I think as a kid, I think of, Alpha Flight should be near X-Men, but in reality, that wasn't the case, and they were definitely off on their own. So what was it like kind of working on a book like that maybe didn't have as clear of an identity once Byrne left after, the first 24 or 5 issues?
Yeah, it was, I thought it was interesting. My one big regret, these days, everybody loves Deadpool and how he is keenly aware of being in a comic, right? Mm-hmm. And at the time on Alpha Flight, there was Bill Mantlo was writing it, and he wanted to take a character who was able to split himself into three characters. One who was a futuristic, really like an amoeba, a caveman, and a futuristic like space, like three evolutions of man. His idea. And he, that character was odd enough as it was. And Bill really wanted to take that character and suddenly make that character aware that he was in a comic book. And at that time, I hated that idea. I was like, that is the worst, I was like, I cannot imagine that working. Now it works with Deadpool great. But, at the time, that was my one big conflict, because I really, when that story came out, because I, as an editor, I try to encourage the writers. You don't stop someone from having an idea. You don't stop someone from trying to bring a good idea, because you don't know. It might be a great idea just because you don't like it. But then when it actually came out, people hated it as well. So it probably was just not the right time for that.
It's really interesting, that it was just way too early to be able to kind of really hit.
Yeah. Yeah, unless like Deadpool is, he's a humorous character. He's a character that's funny, and that's why he can know that he is in comics, because it's a laugh, Excuse me. I gotta get some more.
Looking it up, it would appear that that mannequin character did eventually show up again just a few years ago.
Did he?
Yeah. So no good character or no character stays on forever.
Yeah, but they probably didn't mention that short period of time where he was aware that he was in a comic book.
Maybe not. I'll have to double check, but that's very interesting.
It was literally for just one issue.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, though. Yeah.
That's another thing that I thought, you can't, once you do that, you can't go back. You can't have a character aware that they're dreaming and then, suddenly continue to suddenly not have them aware that they're dreaming.
Interesting. Now, when you do graduate from being, working with Carl to now being a full editor, what was that process like, and how long did you feel like you had to kind of cut your teeth as an assistant before you were able to become a full editor?
Well, you go from assistant editor, and I became what's called a managing editor, which should be a step above editor, but it's not. It's a step under editor, which means there was an editor that was working with me while I had a stable of comics. So I would have a few comics that I could work on that I was managing with an editor over me who was checking over my work. And then, and I was under Bob Budiansky at the time.
Okay.
And then when I graduated to full editor, then I got to do find my own titles and, sort of make my own way and, find the kind of books that I wanted to edit.
Now, just so I can understand the chronology, when this is happening, at what point does the Five Chiefs kind of experiment start? Is this in and around that same period, or were you already full editor before that happened?
No, this was all under Tom DeFalco.
Okay.
From as I recall, yeah, there were different areas. There was like an editor-in-chief, and then there were editors that managed, there was one editor for the Marvel Universe. There was one editor for the New Universe. And there was another editor who was, Archie, who was doing the Epic books. And so they were each responsible for their stuff. And having come out of what I understood as a Shooter era, where Shooter would look at the books and say, no, this sucks. Don't do this. This is how you should do it and not that, which was, everything after that became a reaction to that. No editor wanted to say, no, this is the way you should do it. They were, this is what will make this story better. How do I make you see that? Or do you agree with that? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. As opposed to saying, just redo it, just change it. So nobody wanted to come across that way. The five editors actually don't have a clear memory of that period.
It was, I mean, obviously it was after DeFalco was ousted taken out, and they kind of shifted everything to having, main groups were kind of almost that each group kind of had their own editor-in-chief now, instead of having an overarching editor-in-chief, which does not sound like the most conducive idea.
Yeah, it was, I believe at that time it was done that way because they wanted, that was right before the explosion of the number of titles. And, having one editor-in-chief for all of those, it was, the model for it was sort of the way that I came up, which was there's an editor and I'm a managing editor and I have a stable, but my editor is sort of responsible for his books and my books, but I'm allowed to do my books on my own. The other thing is the other individual sort of universes, sections of the universe, often didn't cross paths because in order to use, if you wanted to, like when I was writing Cage, when I wanted to use the Punisher, I had to get the Punisher plot approved by the Punisher editor to make sure that I was using the Punisher in the correct way. Mm-hmm. And, Captain America, if I wanted to use Captain America, I would have to use him and run that by the Avengers editor and run, what else did I use? But just like essentially any character that I wanted to use, I had to run by that editor and that editor-in-chief. And that became a little issue because, I told you we had issues with Ralph Macchio, and there was I can't remember who it was, but there was a slight conflict where I wanted to do something with Captain America, and he said that would never work because Captain America can't lose. I was like, he has lost lots of times. He never gives up, but he can't. But he's like, Captain America would never lose to the Punisher, and he was just like adamant in that. And I was like, that was sort of hard to deal with because there's always a way to make a good story. If it's at the service of a good story, it can make sense. But when you lay down rules that are just flat rules, this can't happen. It becomes more difficult to be able to tell the kind of stories you want to tell.
For sure. Now, a book I'm always curious about, and you edited for a little bit, and kind of took over from others, was What If? And I always wonder how stressful that type of book must have been, or maybe it was freeing because, on the one hand, you have to come up with new concepts constantly, like they have to be kind of different from others and jumping off of other launching points. So you don't necessarily have a consistent creative team, but at the same time, you can kind of work out a sequence because you're just kind of, developing stories that could almost take place anywhere because it's basically an anthology book where you're just doing a different what if story that's not connected to another. So the creative team can just be whoever, and it doesn't need to be one person hitting every deadline. But I'm curious, from an editor's perspective, how did you feel about it?
Well, What If at that time had become a book where you take a single juncture and sort of tell another story and off of that point. And that became weird because it was like, oh, if this happens, then Spider-Man dies. And if you have something else, well, then everything goes wrong. And so it's like, oh, everything worked out great because that was how it was supposed to work out in the regular Marvel universe. And that seemed kind of that was a kind of a repetitive story. There were no surprises in that. So when I took over What If, I tried to change that formula to say, let's tell really different types of stories about these characters. Let's take a story of where there was a breakout of the vault and then jump forward in time 10 years where the villains from the vault have taken over the Midwest of America and made their own country. And it's not a lawless country. It's an anarchic country which has its own form of government. And really a lot of people wanted to go there and live there and just sort of telling that story, or the story of Spider-Man, after he was bitten by the radioactive spider, started being afraid that he was becoming a spider, and he had a child, and was having blackouts. And if you remember the story, at the end of the story, the twist at the story was that there was somebody that was killing people and draining them of blood, like spiders do. And Peter Parker was afraid that it was him, that when he was having these blackouts, that's what he was doing. And it turned out at the end that it was actually his child who had taken his radioactive blood and become something more, but did not have the sense that you're not supposed to kill other people.
That's right.
Little twists like that were the what if stories that I liked to tell, or that I tried to find writers who wanted to tell them. Once we had a couple of them out there, it was easy to get other people to say, "Oh yeah, you know what? I have a story." So you're telling a story that is at its core, a very human story, using the characters that you love in the Marvel Universe, but telling a very different type of story.
It's interesting hearing you say that, and then looking at some of those what if stories that you're doing. I see what you're talking about, how, you weren't just looking at specific juncture points anymore, and you were doing something very different. And one that I always really enjoyed was what if J. Jonah Jameson adopted Spider-Man? Which was a lot of fun, but again, isn't from a specific crux point, which is especially early what ifs were very much predicated on that. So as you said, you're having a little bit more fun with the openness of the concept, and you're right. It was almost like it was people were using it too limited to just do a small, tighter band of story instead of really kind of going somewhere with it. I'm curious in general, though, some of the stories that you guys ended up doing were still of this kind of juncture point idea, but more so coming off of, really popular storylines. Was there pressure in the office to make, one that took place after the Age of Apocalypse, or, that kind of, or, after Legion Quest with Legion killing, Xavier? Was there pressure to try and tap into those types of storylines for What If?
Well, at the end of the day, there was a very strong sense that if you want your comic to stay alive, you need to make it, you need to do fan service. You need to do something that makes people really interested in this book. And that was often done by guest stars, but for What If, it was done by, by which, you wouldn't do a speedball What If. You'd keep it with the big characters, and they found that, that putting the main characters, and that's when What If, the logo What If became tiny. And What If featuring Wolverine? What If featuring Magneto? What If featuring Spider-Man? And that became the hook by which you could sell that story. Because at the time, if you remember, the distributors got a cover and a description of what happened in the story, a little paragraph. And that's what they used to buy however many comics they wanted. And so you really had to provide a hook that could be sold very quickly and very easily. And that often became with a big logo of a main character, a mainstay character that people wanted to follow and see an alternative version of them. So there was direct pressure to do that. I mean, that was, I don't think that was a bad idea though, in becoming What If, featuring, as opposed to What If as its own title, because it was featuring. It was about the characters, about those specific characters, and playing with the stories that people cared about and characters that people cared about.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting idea and concept, because I remember as a kid looking at those comics and now being like, well, what's happening here? And I think that was the only downfall or downturn of something like that, whereas the previous issues had been right in the title, right? So for better or for worse. And so yeah. I see what you're saying, the idea of that, well, this Spider-Man's here, so that's enough reason to buy this. But it didn't necessarily have the descriptors. So it's an interesting give and take there that I'd never really considered before.
Yeah, we tried to make up for that by, doing a cover blurb that gave a hint to what it was about, which we had a lot of leeway with. But, we were sometimes perhaps too clever by half, with what we were trying, with the blurbs that we came up with, because they were a bit too cryptic. You don't want to give away the end of the story, but you want to hook people with it as much as possible.
When you're working on a book like that, and you do have, again, constant churn of ideas, etc., like how difficult was it to, find people to write or draw these issues? Were people pitching for What If, or were you kind of pitching people concepts, or where did that come from?
The neat thing about What If is that I'm also under Carl, I worked on Marvel. One of the things I broke my teeth on was Marvel Fanfare. And that was under Al Milgram. Al was a freelancer at the time, and he would come in and be a freelancer editor for that title. And he had just several drawers of comics that were by fan favorites who could take their time finishing that story. And once that story was finished, boom, that would be planned for 3 issues in advance. That would be what we'd have. So we would never, we had to have something every month, but we were never without, and that taught me how to sort of do that. So I would try to get multiple stories in the works at the same time. And the cool thing I was able to do with that was find new artists. I was really looking for new artists who wanted to, who had unique styles and unique ways of telling stories. And so that What If lent itself to that very, very much. So it wasn't, I wasn't having Jim Lee, who was on X-Men, on What If, because he was working on X-Men. But I was able to find new artists who I thought were amazing and give them titles and have them really explore their talent in telling a story that was a standalone story.
Obviously, one of the most famous things that you've worked on, which somehow I've neglected it up until this point, is obviously Marvels, which, was hugely influential to this day, and continues to be reprinted in many different collections and versions. What can we say about Marvels? Like, where did that kind of start? I believe it came from Alex Ross initially, but how did you kind of cultivate that project?
Well, I was working with Clive Barker. I was working on Nightbreed and Hellraiser and The Harrowers, a bunch of Clive Barker titles. And Hellraiser was one of the first fully painted comics. So I would often get samples of artists that were doing painted comics. And Clive himself would actually find painted artists at conventions and then forward their work to me. So Alex Ross was found actually by Clive Barker, who forwarded stuff to me. The stuff he forwarded to me were superhero, the things that were printed in the back of the Marvel trade paperback, which are just, Dr. Doom and then some studies of Dr. Doom and the Human Torch and some studies of the Human Torch. And I was just like, wow, this is amazing stuff. This has to be a comic. There's just no way it can't be. And so having found Alex Ross, I was like, we need to find a writer. And Alex at the time knew Kurt Busiek. And Kurt was working on staff, had just left staff actually, I think, to go work freelance. And so Alex was going to be the talent there. And then Kurt lent his mind to it, saying, we're going to tell a realistic type of story. So let's tell a realistic type of story from an everyman perspective. And that was how Marvels was originally birthed. And Marvels was originally figured as a 6-issue painted comic. It was going to be epic. It was going to be, have a broad sweep. It was going to cover multiple sections of the Marvel Universe timeline. And the problem was they were like, you know what? We're going to have this painted comic come out. It's going to take a long time for it to come out. And once we have the first issue out, the second issue is going to, sell a little bit less. And the third issue is probably going to sell a little bit less. And we're going to lose. If we're doing a 6-issue series, we're going to be losing money by the 6th issue. So they told us to shorten it to 4 issues, which to this day I know was a mistake. In hindsight, everybody knows it was a mistake. But it was, so Kurt cut the story down to 4 issues. And, when they actually came out, people were so excited about it. The first issue, was sold at one run, and then the second issue came out and that run increased. So it did not decrease, it increased with the second issue, and the first issue went back to press, which never happens. And then then the third issue sold even more than the second issue. So it was a title that did not lower not go down in terms of the risk that the comic shop owners were willing to take on it. It stayed very high, and it became a phenomenon.
Absolutely. It's such a brilliant book. But I mean, obviously Kurt did a great job with the story, but obviously the real draw obviously is that art by Alex, which is really something. And again, at the time, especially no one really had seen anything quite like it. I mean, obviously, as you said, there's other painted books, but there was just something to the overall sense of realism that Alex brought to it. And obviously, the care he brought to it in terms of, as you said, like even the fact that he was doing character studies and really trying to figure out how these things worked, it really showed up on the page.
Yeah. And I to this day believe that Marvel's influenced lots of stuff, but I really firmly believe that it influenced the first Spider-Man movie, because I feel like that perspective of having people react to Spider-Man as opposed to looking at the whole story through Spider-Man's eyes was a unique perspective that hadn't been done in any of the superhero comics before, or movies before.
Is there any particular kind of moment in Marvel's that you particularly enjoy, either because of how you saw it and in the process, and then seeing Alex's art come in, or is there something in particular about it that really speaks to you?
Every page that came in from him was a wonder, and it was amazing to watch, to see it. I mean, when they came in, everybody would gather in my office just to look at the original artwork. They were really thrilled just to see it. And if you could see some of the original artwork, it's a different experience than seeing the comics. That's sort of true for all comic artwork. But I just really loved the pathos of the mutant issue. The issue where a character was created who was just a little girl who was obviously visually a mutant. She was mutated and was being attacked and hiding out. And the main character, Phil Sheldon, takes her in and realizes that mutants are just people. And that's a perspective that he doesn't have at the beginning of the story, because there is a lot of fear mongering that is happening around that time. And it was a very poignant story, and I felt like it's very hard to take somebody and make them look alien and scary, and at the same time completely sympathetic and almost cute, But it was because that character was both. You felt sympathy for her right away because she felt like just a little girl. But she was also a mutant that had these huge bug eyes and, a bald head with just a few whiffs of hair on it. And she looked completely alien, but she was just a little girl. And that's one of the stories that really struck me, because that really captures the idea of the otherness that was the core of every mutant story. Usually you tell the stories from the mutant's point of view, so that you feel like the world is unfair to me, and as opposed to, again, with Phil Sheldon's opportunity to look at the story from the outside, say, I feel uncomfortable around mutants. I feel like they're scary. I feel like they're dangerous. And then to see a girl that's also a mutant and see people react to her the same way that he had earlier, and then realize that fear was the actual enemy.
I'm trying to remember the chronology here for a second, because I'm trying to think, Kurt working on a book like this, he had obviously, in and around this period, I believe he worked on Spider-Man Legacy of Evil. He did Untold Tales of Spider-Man. I'm trying to think how early in his career this was in terms of kind of doing a book that was kind of set in a previous time, because a big hallmark of it, and this is something that both Kurt and Alex do so well, is really grounding it in the Marvel Universe of the time and having so many Easter eggs of, specific comics that were happening at the same time. Was that a discussion that you had with both of them, or in terms of kind of grounding this in that level, or is that just something that they naturally brought to the project, especially Kurt, because of how he feels about continuity and previous things that happened? I'm curious how that part of it evolved.
Kurt knew continuity, and he went to great pains to find books that came out, this year, this month, this was happening in this comic, this was happening in this comic, this during this quarter of this year, and put all of those into one issue and say they were happening at the same time, and doing that for different sort of periods in Marvel Universe. That was all Kurt because he knew the stories he wanted to tell, and knew his continuity, and just was really, I don't recall that there was a lot of feedback I had to give him because he was a really good. He had cut his teeth doing this fill-in story and that fill-in story. I do not believe he had his own title at that time. He was not known for any title, and there was actually a little bit of pushback when we were doing this huge thing that was going to be invested, that we're paying for a painted comic that was supposed to make a huge splash. And we're not having one of our biggest writers write it. We're instead having Kurt Busiek, who was known more for his fill-in stories, doing that title. He had the talent, though, and he had the ability, and he had the ideas. So I don't know. I'm not aware if this is true or not, but I feel like Marvel's was his break. Was the point where he moved from being just a writer looking for his niche to a writer that could define his own niche.
Interesting. And obviously he did in a big way. And, he worked on so many things at Marvel and did such a great job. But it's interesting to kind of see that this is the initial calling card.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's how I recall it, because I wasn't aware of any comics other than fill-ins or small stories that Kurt was working on. Before that, my exposure to Kurt was his editing of the Ad Astra books. Do you know that one?
No, actually.
It's a science fiction series that he shepherded as the editor, and it was an anthology of a shared science fiction universe. And it was
interesting.
It was pretty cool, but it did not take off, and so maybe a lot of people didn't know it. But then that was shortly after that is when he went and decided to go freelance and write his own stories.
Now, when you're working at Marvel in this time, there's obviously a lot of people were both editors, and then also they take on writing assignments. It was very common at the time. So that then you start working on Cage. I'm curious what it was like to work and launch that character in the kind of the early mid-90s boom, when a lot of books are starting to get greenlit. They're starting to give a lot more opportunities to people who do want to be writing books, and now you're writing Cage. I'm curious how that came about.
At the time, there were a lot of people that worked at Marvel that knew the books and would pitch titles. I put in a pitch for Alpha Flight against Fabian Nicieza, and Fabian was selected for that. And I still think I would have done a better job, but that absolutely launched Fabian's career in doing multiple great things. Howard Mackey was Mark Grunwald's assistant, and he left staff to become a writer, and he, would write Ghost Rider and a lot of other books. And so there was the understanding was that, you didn't get hired because of who you knew. You got hired for the strength of your ideas in being able to do something. I had done a lot of freelance, one standalone titles. I'd done a story for, a lot of stories for Marvel Comics Presents, featuring, I basically wrote every black character I could find. So I wrote a Cloak story. I wrote a Cage story. I wrote a Thing story, because I always thought of the Thing as a black character. I don't know why. And I wrote a bunch of those stories. I wrote a story for Hellraiser. So I had written a lot of stories, but I hadn't gotten the ability to do a series. And so when they were talking about relaunching Power Man, I jumped on that, and I wrote my proposal. I wrote out what I thought it was, and the fact that it wouldn't be called Power Man, and he would not have the same costume, and that he, the core issue for me was that he was a character who was lost and alone, and I wanted to explore that a lot, because he was like this happy-go-lucky, friendly character in Power Man Iron Fist, and then Iron Fist was apparently killed, and he was blamed. He was found guilty, or assumed that he was guilty of killing his best friend, and how that would feel in a world where, you know, you're an ex-con, you are redeeming your history, and suddenly you're cast down to the bottom of the pit, you know, with everyone sort of hating you and just getting a real sense of loss. And so that was what I wanted to explore in Cage, which is why my first story was titled The Drowning Man. Because he was drowning through that entire beginning of that series, until he, you know, could find his way, could find his own people, could reunite with, you know, and found out that him being cast aside by the people that he loved was not the first time that it happened. And I created the backstory of him with his father. I created his father to be a cop, and his mother dying while he was in prison, and never seeing her, never being able to see her death or attend her funeral. All that stuff was backstory that was never covered because we never knew exactly where he came from. And, you know, that made him really tragic and really showed why he wanted to distance himself from other people. He was a hero because of who he was. Mm-hmm. But in order to be that hero, he needed to do it in a way that let him distance himself from other people. So he was a hero for hire. And that payment, that thing of saying, I'm doing this because it's my job, is let him sort of, you know, protect himself from getting close to people again. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, as it is, he couldn't avoid getting close to people. And I was sort of trying to develop a love story for him. But then that's when the series ended.
Now, a couple of quick comments that you mentioned, you know, obviously, as you said, the first issue called The Drowning Man, that first page splash is very haunting. Like, just with all the creepy chemicals and him just kind of looking up and kind of being stuck there is a very evocative image.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the feeling I was going for the whole series. And it was, to get back to your original question, I'm sorry, I realized I never answered it. I wrote that proposal with that's how I felt it would be. And there was some real good feedback because I originally was going to have him be in New York, because if you're in New York, you have a large possibility of crossovers. And Tom DeFalco said, you know, why don't we got a lot of heroes in New York. Why don't we put him in somewhere else? Why don't we put him like Chicago? And I was like, okay. And that's kind of cool, because then that would avoid him if he wanted to team, because, you know, with all the heroes in New York, you can't tell large stories without it being implausible that a whole bunch of heroes would get involved. But in Chicago, he's across the country. By the time anybody found out something going on, it would be nearly over. And I tried to give him world-shattering stuff to be able to take down, to be able to be responsible for, even though he wasn't that kind of, you know, world-level threat hero. Mm-hmm. So I think that the strength of that idea was what I think got me the series.
I always love that the first issue's cover where he's like crushing the old costume and kind of ripping it all up was a great kind of statement of, no, this isn't what this isn't what you might think it is. This is going to be something different. This is going to be, you know, trailblazing a new path for this character that you may think you know, but we're going to do something different.
Yeah, and I got to give props to Dwayne Turner because he was amazing. His stuff was really cool, and you know, he was the perfect artist for that series. I can't imagine anybody that would have done a better job.
When you have Iron Fist kind of come back and you get to have him in that 12th issue, did you have pressure on yourself to find a way to kind of bring Danny into that story in a way that made sense?
Yeah, but I also, you know, at the time he had been brought back by John Byrne, and he was in Submariner, the Submariner comic, and so he wasn't a character that I could have used very long in Cage. So I needed to bring them back together, get some sort of resolution, but then at the same time leave it in such a way that he could leave again and there could be room for further growth. Like, in other words, there could be some reckoning of that, but it wouldn't be like everything's all good now and we're buddies.
Was that a challenging experience to try and kind of come up with something that, like, you know, now that Iron Fist is back, you have to, it's an elephant in the room. Like, you have to mention it. But as you said, like, trying to find a way to then also be able to not have him stay in the story.
Yeah, well, I mean, it lent itself to that because he came back in New York. He came back in the Submariner comics, and if he came back, and would find out immediately that that his best friend was accused of his murder, he should go look him up right away. Mm-hmm. But he didn't. And so I was like, he didn't go. Even after all that, Cage put all that stuff, all that effort into him, and he still didn't. It wasn't there for him. Danny Rand was not there for him when it sort of counted. And that was one of those other themes that Cage has been hurt all his life. His father abandoned him because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and was accused of crimes. And his father was a cop and was very unforgiving and abandoned him. And his brother abandoned him. And now Danny Rand abandoned him. And this is a guy who, his toughness comes out of necessity because of the tragedy that his life had been up to that point in so many ways. And that was the thing I wanted to explore with him as a son figure, with him as a father figure, with him as a black man in an age where he can be, marginalized, and, just exploring that was my challenge, was my goal.
Now, obviously, in anything that's both art and commerce, as you said, like, you have to kind of manage, trying to tell good stories, but also being mindful of the commercial aspect and the fact that at the end of the day, things need to sell. So when you do have characters like the Hulk show up or Rhino, et cetera, how much extra thought did you really put into making sure that it felt organic, and also, as you said before, also clearing it through the right offices, like when you get the Punisher being in the book as well. Like, you're trying to manage the story you want to tell, the characterization you want to go on, so you can really delve into the character, but also managing the, and being mindful, because you have been an editor, in a way that maybe another writer who wouldn't have been as acutely aware of how a book sales are going. So also trying to make sure that you have these big guest stars or big villains, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like it had to be organic. At the time, the Hulk was easily organic because at the time he was doing the thing with Cassandra, with the seer, who would send him places to deal with significant threats. And the significant threat, I was trying to make it a galaxy level threat that Cage was dealing with, but that at the time that called Hulk to go out there and deal with it. But then by the time it was dealt with, because, you don't know that someone averted the end of the world by doing this one little thing. But that was the point of that story, is that Cage did in that story save the world. And, they had to be organic stories. They had to be stories that came out of, who the characters were. The Punisher traveled the country so he could come to Chicago. There wasn't a way I could get Spider-Man in Chicago easily. The Hulk traveled around, so I could get him into Chicago. Villains would be easy to get there. So, but I didn't want to just create reuse old characters. I wanted to, create some new villains. And, I love the character Kickback, even though I killed him in the Punisher issue. Because I think he was, the idea of him has been duplicated a lot of times in other characters, as a character who could, jump back in time, like 30 seconds, I think it was, and this is before Galaxy Quest came out, even. And so he could go back a little bit in time and change something, if he was, to change something significant. And that, to me, was a great power to have. Absolutely. But unfortunately, he couldn't go back far enough to avoid his own death.
adding extra level of tragedy to the character. Now, I'm curious, as you said, like the book unfortunately went 20 issues, so just over a year and a half. Did you have, like, when the book was coming to a close, were you afforded the option, like you end your story arc? Did you know in advance that this was going to be it, or was it kind of a last minute decision in terms of pulling the plug? Like, did you feel like you were able to kind of stick the landing, or did you have to kind of escalate some of the elements you were working on so that you could come to a better conclusion?
I think it ended after the story of of Cage being possessed.
That's right.
Yeah, and that was supposed to lead into a new arc. And what had to happen instead was that it just was like when that story ended, it just had to end. And that was unfortunate because, I mean, you're always working towards making, new arcs, new stories, but new directions you can take the character. But when I was told that probably about 5 issues before it was canceled, that it was at risk. And I was like, trying to pull out all my stops in the types of stories and the types of drama I was trying to put in there, but we did not. But it was in the middle of the story, so I really couldn't pull in. Before that, we had done the Evil and the Cure, the crossover with Terror Inc. and Silver Sable, and that I think was a mistake. That really pulled the stories down because it was really a round robin story where each of us got together, talked about what we wanted to do, where the story would start and where the story had to end, and everything in the middle we could just do whatever we wanted. And but I feel like it didn't gather enough interest, it didn't get enough publicity, it didn't gather enough excitement about those characters, and so I think by the end of the next year, all 3 of those titles were canceled.
Well, I mean, I guess looking back, there was a lot of books that started kind of hitting these kids at that time, and they started kind of, as you said, like all those books that had been launched in the early 90s, that kind of started to come to an end.
Yeah, and some of them were really good. And when I worked on a series called Clive Barker's Razor Line, because I was still working with Clive Barker, and there was Hyperkind, which I still think is one of the greatest comics that no one's ever heard of. Hokum and Hex, which was hilarious about a failed magician who gains actual magical powers. And just like a lot of times, Saint Sinner, which was written by Elaine Lee. And Hyperkind. Oh, and Ecto Kid, which was written by, well, I don't know what to say now. Lana Wachowski, who at the time was Larry Wachowski.
Oh, yes, of course.
One of the Wachowski siblings. And so there were really great people doing really great stories. And when I was done at Marvel, we were doing a second round. We were trying to revive it, and there were like 4 more titles that were in the drawer. There were 4 issues in the drawer ready to go when they downsized everything. And so I assume that those all went back to Clive Barker, but it was just sad to know that there was these great titles, these great stories, that just would never see the light of day at Marvel. And I've never seen them come out, which is even more sad. I've never seen those books actually come out.
Now, you mentioned, like, obviously at the end of your time at Marvel, what can you say about what kind of led you to leave?
Well, it was a downsizing. I mean, Ron Perlman, not that Ron Perlman, bought it and decided that he was going to create a media empire, and decided that we had to put out X number of comics this year and X times 5 next year and X times 10 the next year. And cereal boxes and all kinds of crossover stuff. He wanted to create a media empire, and Marvel was his start. Now, that wasn't a bad thing to think about, but he had no idea how to do it. And the way he was making us do it basically led to the implosion of comics, the comics market, the direct market. And that really, that blew up everything. So then Marvel suddenly was with all these comics, they had to cancel half of them, and they had to get rid of the staff to downsize and they went through 2 of those. And I remember the feeling during the first one, people were just getting called in, and you knew anybody that got called in was leaving. And it was really heartbreaking. I survived the first round, and then in a couple weeks they had a second round, or a month they had a second round. That period in between, the fun Marvel office that we used to play around and do, paintball games and have parties, became something different. It became really sad and quiet and just, low level of energy. So that when the second go round came around and I was one of the people that was going to got called into the office, I was like, I remember walking in and seeing Bob Harris, who had been letting people go all day. And he looked like he'd just been beaten up. He did not look happy, and he had to be there to tell everybody that they had to be let go. And at that point, I was like, I would rather be me being let go than him staying on. It was a really hard time. And then afterwards, after we all got let go, we all went to a bar and hung out all till late into the night. And then they let me. What's weird about Marvel is that we had contracts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the contracts were guaranteed. They let me go with 6 months on my contract, which meant they had to still pay me for 6 months. But I just wasn't working there. And that was just the weirdest thing.
I could have still been working.
Yeah, I never understood the business decision to do that, because every editor had a contract and they were all about the same time, and they let everybody go at a really weird time and still had to pay everybody. I didn't understand how that makes sense. But, it was a hard time for me, and I was ready to leave New York at that point. So, there was opportunities. I could say a lot of people went over and started working at DC. A lot of people went into California and started working out there. And I was just like, I've done what I wanted to do, and I don't know if I could do it any better. And so I'll do another career now. I've changed careers 4 times in my life. And that was the first one.
Was it hard to do that the first time? Because this had been something that you wanted, and it was more closely connected to kind of you being a younger person and having these ideas of things that you wanted to do. Was that hardest the first time?
It was very hard because Marvel was the best job in the world, because all you do is make up stuff about characters that you really love and that you care about, and try to make great stories that will entertain people and get people excited. There's sort of nothing better for a creative person than to be able to do that. So that, in that sense, it was a great job, but I also had confidence in my ability to move to amortize my other talents, because I graduated as an illustrator and I had a talent in writing, and I had, there's lots of things that I could be able to do. And so it was just for every door that opens, for every door that closes, another door opens, but it can be hell in the hallway for a while.
I like that. Well, Marcus, thank you so much for taking the time today to, go back in the Wayback Machine and tell us about these days at Marvel. And, I was reading a bunch of these books at the time, and I remember seeing your name in some of these credits. And so it was really nice to be able to, hear your own impressions of what it was like to work on these books.
Thank you. It's been fun to reminisce about some of this stuff. I don't often think about it, but it's really is fun to think about it.
Have you, Kevin, actually, I have last question, I guess, which sounds like an exit interview type of question, but, did you end up keeping in contact with, any of those people that you had made friends with, kind of in the Marvel offices?
Mainly on Facebook. I'm still friends with Steve Busolato and Mark Siri, and Dave Wall, and Rick Parker. He's a really good guy. But there's a lot of people I've lost touch with, and it's sort of a little sad, but it's sort of the way things go.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, sort of bring you down at the end.
No, not unlike the stories I was sort of trying to tell with Cage. I never made that connection until just now.
Interesting. So you are Cage.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much. I'll let you get back to your evening, but I really appreciate you taking the time to regale me with your stories.
All right. Thank you.